Hi peeps, Tess back in the old squat box once again, and I'm probably going to upset a lot of people with what I'm about to say, because the fact is that in our society, in Britain, we have a huge amount of housing which has been transferred, wrongly in my view, over to the private sector, which is now not being utilised as housing. A lot of it has been modernised and upgraded in order to look for a market which wasn't there. That is, a market where people with high earnings would, want to rent certain properties for a high level of expenditure. And what's happened is they've ended up having to rent it out to people who are getting money from social welfare. You know what I mean? No, government social welfare. And every year they put the price of the rental for that property up, and apparently the government thinks it can do nothing other than pay that money because they have a legal, what do you call it, a legal obligation to house people who register as unemployed with family and register themselves as homeless. The councils in Britain find themselves in a position where they are legally bound to find housing for those families, right? And this Thatcher started this by allowing people to buy property owned by councils. You could buy your council house, that's fine, except she didn't allow them to use the money from the sale of those council houses to build new council houses. Therefore, it's a diminishing resource. And now we find ourselves in the situation where we have not enough houses for the amount of people who we have in Britain that need housed. And we've got these people who bought their houses and then sold it in order to move into a better accommodation. They sold the house they bought that they had already purchased from the private housing, from the public housing, and brought into the private sector. Now they've sold it on to basically people who farmed this. They sucked it all up. I drink your milkshake. They sucked all that stuff up, gave people enough to move on to private housing, and now they've got a huge stock, lots and lots of houses which they rent to basically the government, and the government's stuck where every year the rent goes up and they've got to pay it. They've got to pay 400 quid for a house that's only worth 120 because there's no other houses to house people who were homeless, you know what I mean? So the council has to pay that money. They know they're overpaying for these properties, but if you go to the private sector, that's what that house is worth, so that's what you're going to pay. But again, this is like a booming industry, you know what I mean? It's like, the housing boom, it's like houses are overpriced because there's more people than there is houses. Margaret Thatcher started that, as I said again, by selling off the stock that was owned publicly into the private sector, and because of all that, there was no need to pay for companies to build you a house. In the private sector, you could just buy a cheap, public sector house, modernise the inside. You didn't have to buy land or pay to have a house built. If you want to become a landlord, you just bought cheaply off of the stock that already existed. You know what I mean? But then it reduced the stock available for people, being born into, unwealthy families who depended on social housing to house their kids, So therefore we have this dearth of houses and exploding population, especially after the European expansion, and people come from Poland and Czechoslovakia and places like that, into Britain. And not to mention that they're already rising influx of foreigners immigrating to Britain, which, don't get me wrong, we need. I'm not saying we shouldn't have it, but what I'm saying is we destroyed the existing structure that was there for building new housing. Thatch destroyed it by releasing lots of public housing into the private sector. You know what I mean? It was a fucking bad idea, terrible idea, and we continue with that terrible bad idea. So here's my fucking view of things. If you can't rent your property for 12 months in a 2-year period, for 12 months in a 24-hour period, a 24-year period, month period, if you can't rent your house for a 12-month period over a 24-month period, your council can force you to sell that property to them, and it becomes public property and can be used to be released and rented as a public fucking resource. If you've made a terribly bad investment, you have to sell at the price you bought it for back to the council. And we could recoup a lot of housing, because there's a lot of housing that are bought up by people and they've never spent a penny on them. They're actually trying to just, buy crappy fucking buildings and then just lease those crappy buildings at exorbitant fucking rates back to the council, you know what I mean? So I would say the council shouldn't fucking lease these fucking buildings because they don't come up to spec. No, if you're not going to spend the money to refurbish and improve that property, then you shouldn't be able to fucking rent it back to the council. I mean, so if you can't rent that house for 12 months out of 24 months, the council can force you to sell it back to them at the price you bought it for from the council in the first fucking place. That's how I would recoup some of the housing that was missold into the public, the private sector, and bring it back into the public sector. And I would do away with the fucking law that Thatch had fucking put into place, that councils who sold off council property into the private sector couldn't use that money to rebuild new property. I would do away with that fucking law right away and allow councils not only to rebuild but to borrow to rebuild. You know what I mean? The council should have the right to borrow, I would think, something like 18 to 20, somewhere between 18 and 30, so 18 and 30% of their total yearly income. Because I mean, well, if the government can borrow 80% of the fucking GDP, you know what I mean? if that's our debt, I'm sure councils should be able to have a 20 or 30% fucking debt, you know what I mean? Running debt into the future, which they pay the interest on and keep, and pay some it off, but eventually they will go over 100 years to pay off their debt. I mean, isn't that what a household does? Isn't that what an individual does? I mean, you take a credit card, you pay 30% interest on anything you buy. You can't afford that fucking car that costs £30,000. You pay it over 5 years. You can't over 5 years. You can't afford the house, the £80,000 or the £140,000. You pay it over 30 years. Why shouldn't a council be able to borrow? Just what a government does and just what individuals do. Why shouldn't councils be able to borrow? So long as they have a plan in place. You know what I mean? And they work it out over 20, 30 years to pay that money back and make improvements in their infrastructure, bridges, motorways in their area, shopping centres, you know what I mean, housing. I don't see the problem there. These are things that, as a society, we need to look at and say, well, if it's okay for one side of our fucking political system, it should be perfectly fine for the other side, you know what I mean? If it's okay for individuals to get into that amount of debt, and let's face it, that's what fucked the whole fucking world up, is so many people being in debt and never being able to pay it. So we need to maybe have some restrictions on the amount of debt you can take over the length of time, yeah. I can afford to have like maybe £1,000 debt over a year, but I can't afford to have a £10,000 debt over a year. That's just not, I can afford £1,000 in a year, but not 10,000. I can afford maybe £10,000 over 10 years, and that would be the same with councils. It would be the same with governments. You cannot borrow, 300 times GDP, but you can probably afford to borrow maybe 10 or 20% of your GDP per year, so long as you eventually fucking do something to pay some of it off. I mean, you're talking about 20, 30, 50-year plans here for governments, you know what I mean? And it should be the same for councils and the same for individuals. You plan for, your lifetime. Now, people say, well, the lifetime of a government is 4 years. Well, that's not true. The lifetime of a government is like a generation, or maybe two, You become a politician when you're 20, you get involved, you become elected when you're in your 30s, and you retire in your 60s or 70s, So from your 30s to your 70s, there's 40 years, you know what I mean? So although you might not be in power every year, you know what I mean? Your government, the political side you are involved in might not get elected every 4 or 5 years. You're going to be in and out over that 40-year period. So yes, you should be able to make deals which cover the 40 years that you're expected to be a politician. So it's not so much about individual parties. It's more to do with the people who are in those parties understanding that we should not have 2-year deals that bankrupt the country, but we should not have 100-year deals which bankrupt generations, So there's got to be something in there where, you can make deals where you can be held accountable within your 40-year period of working in office, barring mishaps and accidents where you die after, getting elected and, get drunk, fall off a chair, or your lover stabs you, or you're involved in a plane crash, or whatever. But these things happen. But generally politicians are only for 40 or 50 years. Let's have you plan. You're bullshitting for 40 or 50 years. Let's have the councils be able to do the fucking same thing. Ordinary people are allowed to borrow money over the length of their lifetime. Parliaments, yeah, we say it's a 5-year thing, but it's not. It's more a 40, 50-year thing, because that's how long the people involved in those parliaments are going to be in and out of fucking power. And they're going to have to agree with each other. When we get into power, we will guarantee to pay the shit that you've already, said you'll pay, so long as you guarantee what we say we're going to take on debt. And you don't spend everything up to your limit and over it. You be frugal. You try to be frugal. You know what I mean? When you're in power. The point is not to spend everything you can. It's to spend as least you can to get the best results. Please, politicians, when you're in power, think of it as if you've just got married, but you've got to remember to save some money for your kids' fucking college, you know what I mean? That's what I'm thinking, That's the way you should be thinking when you get into power, Yeah. You might get in power this year, but next year you could have a fucking kid that you've got to pay for college fees for in 30 years' time. This is the way you should be thinking when you become a politician. What am I going to have to be paying for in 30 years? So I don't want to spend everything this year, you know what I mean? I'm just saying. But that idea where, if you have bought property from the council, or, from, public, housing stock, if you can't afford to fucking, or you can't get people to fucking rent that off you for a 12-month period and then a 24-month period, the council that you bought it from should be able to force you to sell it back to them at the price that you bought it from them for. So if you got it off them for £50,000 and you're renting it out as if it's worth £120,000 and nobody will rent it from you, the council gets to buy it back off you for the £50,000. Simple as that. Fuck you. You weren't able to fucking do it because you were a greedy bastard. You know what I mean? We gave you the opportunity to fucking, fix it up and make money. You fucked it up. We want it back. There's the money you fucking, put on it. But we're going to take it over and sort it out now. Fuck you. You know what I mean? That's the way I look at it. Yes, there is huge opportunities in the world. But if you want to fuck it up because you're a greedy bastard, fuck you. Society needs to not have fuckers like you fucking us up every minute of the fucking day. So sometimes we have to turn around and say, you know what? Fuck you, we're taking it back, and there's the money you put down it. What, you didn't make any profit? Tough fucking luck, you know what I mean? You obviously weren't enterprising enough, you fucking wanker, you know what I mean? Sometimes you win, sometimes you fucking lose. Well, this time, it wasn't society that lost, it was fucking you that lost. And you didn't lose anything really, you still got your money back. All you lost was time. You didn't lose any money. Normally society loses money and fucking time. All you lost was time, you got your money back. Be happy with that, fucker. Slangy fucking fat.